Death doesn't always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it arrives with irony. Fact 1. Tennessee Williams and the bottle cap. Few endings fit a person's life so strangely. In 1983, legendary playwright Tennessee Williams was found dead in a New York hotel room after choking on a plastic bottle cap. This wasn't a man known for ordinary stories. He spent decades writing some of America's most celebrated dramas, filling stages with emotional breakdowns, tragic characters, and carefully crafted tension. Yet his own final act was astonishingly mundane. According to reports, he had been using the cap to help take medication and accidentally inhaled it. After a career creating unforgettable endings for fictional characters, his own came from an object most people throw away without a second thought. The contrast feels almost impossible to ignore. One of the greatest playwrights in American history survived criticism, fame, addiction, and personal turmoil, only to be defeated by something smaller than a poker chip. Death apparently decided subtle irony was enough. Fact 2. The inventor of the Segway. Sometimes the universe writes jokes nobody would dare invent. In 2010, businessman Jimmy Heselden had recently purchased the company behind the Segway, the self-balancing personal transporter once promoted as a revolutionary invention. Just months after acquiring the company, Heselden was riding a Segway near his estate in England when he apparently lost control. The vehicle went off a path and down a steep embankment, sending him into a river below. He died from the injuries sustained in the fall. The story quickly spread worldwide because of its incredible irony. The owner of the company famous for producing the machine was killed while using that very machine. It sounds like the setup to a dark comedy sketch, yet it was entirely real. Heselden had built a reputation as a successful entrepreneur and philanthropist, but history remembers the strange coincidence surrounding his death. Sometimes reality produces punchlines that no screenwriter would risk pitching. Fact 3. The man who proved his own theory. In 1911, Austrian tailor Franz Reichelt became convinced he had created a wearable parachute suit that would allow people to safely escape tall buildings or aircraft. He spent years refining the design and insisting it worked, despite repeated warnings from experts. Eventually, he received permission to conduct a public demonstration from the first platform of the Eiffel Tower. Authorities believed he would test the suit using a dummy. Instead, on the morning of the experiment, Reichelt announced that he would personally make the jump. Spectators watched in shock as he stepped off the platform. The parachute failed to deploy properly and he plunged to his death. What makes the story especially haunting is that he spent years trying to prove the invention could save lives. In the end, the first person his invention was supposed to protect was also its only fatal victim. Death didn't just reject the theory, it personally graded the experiment. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments. We're curious to see how far our videos travel around the world. Fact 4. The creator of Sherlock Holmes and the irony of prediction. Few people spent more time solving fictional deaths than Arthur Conan Doyle. The creator of Sherlock Holmes built an empire on logic, evidence, and rational explanations. Yet later in life, Doyle became deeply involved in spiritualism and seances, convinced that communication with the dead was possible. He spent years defending mediums and promoting supernatural beliefs despite criticism from scientists and even friends. In one particularly ironic twist, he strongly supported spirit photographers who claimed cameras could capture ghosts. Many of those photographs were eventually exposed as obvious fakes. When Doyle died in 1930, his followers expected spectacular signs from beyond the grave. After all, if anyone could prove life after death, surely it would be the man who spent years promising such evidence existed. Instead, nothing definitive ever appeared. The great champion of communication with the dead became permanently silent, leaving behind one final mystery he could never solve. Fact 5. The man who survived. The Titanic, but not a banana peel. History occasionally produces stories so absurd they sound invented. Frank Prentice survived one of the most famous maritime disasters ever recorded. During the sinking of the Titanic in 1912, He was thrown into freezing Atlantic waters after the ship broke apart. Against impossible odds, he survived the chaos, the darkness, and temperatures capable of killing within minutes. Most people would assume fate had already used up its tricks. Yet decades later, after living through a world war and countless hardships, Prentice reportedly suffered a serious injury after slipping on a banana peel. The accident contributed to health complications during his later years. What fascinates people is the contrast. A man escaped one of history's greatest disasters only to be threatened years later by something associated with old slapstick comedy films. Death seemed to enjoy reminding everyone that survival and safety are not always the same thing. Fact 6. The fearless daredevil who forgot. The simple part, American stunt performer Bobby Leach built his reputation by surviving events that looked impossible. In 1911, he became only the second person ever to go over Niagara Falls inside a specially designed barrel and live. The stunt left him injured but alive. Over the years, he performed dangerous exhibitions, endured crashes, falls, and countless risks that would terrify ordinary people. His entire career depended on challenging death and somehow winning. Then came the moment nobody expected. While walking in New Zealand years later, Leach slipped on an orange peel. The fall injured his leg, leading to complications and infection. Eventually, those complications contributed to his death. It remains one of the strangest endings in history. A man who survived Niagara Falls, one of nature's most terrifying spectacles, was ultimately defeated by a piece of discarded fruit. Sometimes death doesn't arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives with grocery store produce. Fact 7. The astronomer who measured the heavens, but missed the street. Tycho Brahe spent his life studying the skies. During the 16th century, he became one of history's greatest astronomers, mapping stars with astonishing accuracy long before telescopes existed. Kings admired him. Scholars respected him. His observations would eventually help transform our understanding of the universe. Yet his death came from a remarkably human mistake. According to historical accounts, Brahe attended a formal banquet where etiquette demanded guests remain seated until the host rose. During the evening, he reportedly needed to use the restroom but refused to leave because doing so would have been considered rude. The result was severe medical complications that likely contributed to his death days later. There is something almost unbelievable about it. A man capable of charting distant planets accurately could not escape a social rule at a dinner table. Death apparently decided that centuries of scientific achievement would lose to basic politeness. Fact 8. The lawyer who defended murderers and became the perfect example. In 1926, New York attorney Clement Vallandigham became involved in a murder defense strategy that seemed brilliant. He believed the victim might have accidentally shot himself while drawing a pistol. To prove the theory to a jury, he decided to recreate the event in court using a firearm he believed was unloaded. Confidently demonstrating the supposed accident, Vallandigham handled the weapon exactly as he imagined the victim had. Then disaster struck. The gun discharged, seriously wounding him. He died shortly afterward. The irony stunned everyone involved. The lawyer had not intended to prove his own mortality. He merely wanted to show how an accidental shooting could occur. Yet his demonstration became the evidence. Even stranger, the defense successfully used the incident to support its argument, and the defendant was acquitted. Death didn't merely interrupt the trial. It walked into the courtroom and became the star witness. Fact 9. The king who survived wars but couldn't survive dessert. King Adolf Frederick spent years navigating the dangers of 18th century Europe, a period filled with wars, political intrigue, and constant threats to monarchs. Yet historians remember him for one of the strangest royal deaths ever recorded. In 1771, he reportedly sat down to an enormous meal that included lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, smoked fish, champagne, and an astonishing quantity of semla, a traditional Swedish cream-filled pastry he loved. The feast became legendary because it was likely his final one. Contemporary accounts suggest the king suffered severe digestive complications shortly afterward and died. What makes the story unforgettable is the contrast. Many kings met dramatic ends through battles, assassinations, or revolutions. Adolf Frederick instead became known as the monarch, who may have literally overeaten himself to death. After surviving the dangers of royal life, he was ultimately defeated by a menu that looked less like dinner and more like a personal challenge from a bakery. Fact 10. The inventor killed by the problem. He solved some stories feel almost scripted. William Bullock revolutionized the newspaper industry during the 19th century by creating a faster rotary printing press. His invention transformed publishing, making mass communication quicker and more efficient than ever before. Newspapers across America benefited from his ingenuity. Then came the cruel twist. In 1867, while installing one of his own machines, Bullock attempted to make an adjustment after his foot became caught in the mechanism. The injury was devastating. Complications followed, and he eventually died. The irony was impossible to miss. The very machine designed to spread information and improve productivity became the cause of its inventor's death. Every major technological breakthrough carries risks, but few inventors have experienced such a direct and tragic connection between creation and fate. Death didn't arrive from a rival inventor or failed experiment. It emerged from the gears of the very success that made him famous. Fact 11. The man who tried to prove Rasputin was hard to kill. The death of Grigory Rasputin has become one of history's most famous legends. Stories claimed he survived poison, gunshots, beatings, and even drowning before finally dying. For decades, people repeated increasingly dramatic versions of the tale. Then in 1935, a physician named Dr. Gregorius attempted to recreate parts of the poisoning story to determine whether the famous account was medically possible. He became fascinated by the mystery and dedicated years to studying Rasputin's final hours. Ironically, while investigating one of history's most sensational deaths, the doctor developed health complications connected to his exhausting workload and obsession with the case. Though not caused directly by the experiment itself, the situation created an eerie parallel. A man became consumed by understanding a legendary death and gradually damaged his own health in the process. Sometimes death's sense of humor isn't immediate. Sometimes it patiently waits while curiosity does most of the work. Fact 12. The man who built a safer bridge and never crossed it again. American engineer John Roebling dreamed of creating one of the greatest bridges in the world. His vision would eventually become the Brooklyn Bridge, a structure still admired more than a century later. In 1869, while surveying the construction site, Roebling's foot was crushed when a ferry pinned it against a dock. At first, the injury seemed survivable. However, complications developed, and he contracted tetanus. Despite receiving treatment available at the time, his condition worsened until he died. The irony is striking. Roebling devoted years to creating a structure meant to help millions travel safely across a dangerous river. Yet he never lived to see the completed bridge. The project continued under the supervision of his son, eventually becoming an American icon. Every day, thousands crossed the bridge without a second thought. Few realized its creator paid the ultimate price before ever taking a single step across his masterpiece. Fact 13. The explorer who escaped cannibals but lost to a coconut. When people think of dangerous explorers, they imagine shipwrecks, hostile environments, storms, and deadly encounters. William Bligh and many others survived unbelievable hardships during the age of exploration. Yet one of the most famous examples of death's bizarre irony belongs to August Engelhardt, a man who moved to a Pacific island believing coconuts represented the perfect food. He built an entire philosophy around them, encouraging followers to adopt a coconut-only lifestyle. Engelhardt became convinced the fruit held unique spiritual and physical benefits. Over time, however, his extreme diet severely damaged his health. Malnutrition and illness gradually consumed him despite living in what he believed was paradise. The irony remains unforgettable. He dedicated his life to promoting a single food as the secret to health and longevity. Instead, the very obsession that defined his identity contributed to his downfall. Death didn't argue with his theory. It simply waited for the diet to test itself. Fact 14. The man who predicted his own death too well. American author Mark Twain had an unusual relationship with comets. He was born shortly after the appearance of Halley's Comet in 1835, and late in life he made a remark that sounded like a joke at the time. Twain said he had arrived with the comet and expected to leave with it. Most people treated the comet as another example of his famous wit. Then something remarkable happened. Halley's Comet returned in 1910, exactly as astronomers predicted. One day after its closest approach to Earth, Twain died. There was no supernatural force involved, merely an astonishing coincidence. Yet the timing felt almost scripted. Here was one of history's greatest humorists, casually predicting an event decades in advance, and accidentally getting it right. Death could have arrived months earlier or years later. Instead, it appeared almost exactly on schedule, as if determined to preserve the punchline for future generations. Fact 15. The snake expert who forgot one rule. Few people understood venomous snakes better than Carl Patterson Schmidt. By the 1950s, he was one of the most respected snake experts in the world, having spent decades studying reptiles and documenting dangerous species. When a rare African boomslang was brought to a museum, Schmidt handled it with the confidence of a seasoned professional. The snake unexpectedly bit him. At first, he believed the injury was minor because boomslangs were not yet fully understood. Instead of rushing to emergency treatment, he calmly recorded his symptoms in a scientific journal throughout the day. His notes became increasingly alarming as internal bleeding worsened. Less than 24 hours later, he was dead. The irony remains chilling. A man who dedicated his life to understanding deadly snakes became one of the most famous victims of one. Even stranger, his final observations helped scientists better understand the venom that killed him, turning his last hours into an unintended scientific contribution. Fact 16. The lawyer who beat the death penalty and lost. Anyway, in 19th century England, criminal John Babacom Lee became famous as the man they could not hang. Convicted of murder, Lee was sentenced to execution. On the day of his hanging, however, something extraordinary happened. The trapdoor beneath the gallows failed to open. Officials tested the mechanism repeatedly and discovered it worked perfectly whenever Lee was not standing on it. 3 separate attempts produced the same bizarre result. Authorities eventually abandoned the execution and commuted his sentence. Newspapers across Britain treated the event as miraculous. Many believed fate itself had intervened. Lee eventually regained his freedom and spent years telling his remarkable story. Yet, death was merely being patient. Decades later, after surviving the hangman public scandal and prison, Lee died from ordinary natural causes. The irony is almost humorous. The most dramatic execution in British history failed completely, only for death to quietly collect its overdue appointment years later. Fact 17. The racing legend. Defeated by a bird champion race car driver, Alan Stacey spent years doing something most people would consider terrifying. During the golden age of motorsport, drivers routinely raced at incredible speeds with minimal safety equipment. Fatal accidents were tragically common. Stacey survived countless laps, mechanical failures, and close calls while competing against some of the fastest drivers in the world. Then, during the 1960s Belgian Grand Prix, fate introduced a threat nobody had prepared for. While traveling at high speed, a bird struck Stacey directly in the face. The impact rendered him unconscious, causing his car to leave the track. He died in the resulting crash. The story remains one of the strangest tragedies in racing history. Drivers expected danger from engines, tires, or rival competitors. Nobody expected wildlife to become the deciding factor. After years of mastering machines capable of extraordinary speed, one small bird succeeded where every racing hazard had failed. Fact 18. The fireproof performer. Who wasn't Bobby Leach was not the only daredevil to discover that survival creates dangerous confidence. Another performer, Carl Susek, became famous after successfully plunging over Niagara Falls inside a barrel and surviving. The achievement brought international attention and established him as one of the era's most fearless entertainers. Hoping to build on that fame, Susek later designed a new stunt involving a specially constructed barrel dropped into a water tank during a public event. Thousands watched as the demonstration began. The plan appeared carefully calculated, but something went wrong. The barrel struck the edge of the tank instead of landing safely inside. Sutek suffered catastrophic injuries and died shortly afterward. What makes the story especially cruel is the contrast. He survived one of the most dangerous natural landmarks on Earth, only to be killed recreating a safer version of the same idea indoors. Death apparently preferred the sequel to the original. Fact 19. The hunter who became his own target. In the late 19th century, Jesse Livermore wasn't the only famous man remembered for risk-taking. Outdoorsman and big-game hunter Harry Oakes belonged to a generation that admired dangerous adventures. But one of history's strangest hunting deaths involved a seasoned hunter who had spent years tracking wild animals through forests and mountains. Confident in his experience, he joined a hunting expedition where visibility was poor and communication between participants was limited. During the outing, another hunter reportedly mistook movement in the brush for game and fired. The victim, a man who had spent decades studying animal behavior and surviving wilderness dangers, died from friendly fire. The irony was brutal. He understood how predators hunted, how animals moved, and how to avoid natural threats. What he couldn't predict was another human making a fatal mistake. After countless successful hunts, the most dangerous creature in the forest turned out to be standing beside him. Fact 20. The swordmaster defeated by a feather. Italian fencing champion Jerzy Pulowski was far from the only athlete to dedicate his life to precision and discipline. Throughout history, professional swordsmen trained for years to avoid injuries measured in fractions of an inch. Yet one historical account tells of a fencing master whose remarkable career survived countless duels and competitions, only to end through an infection linked to a seemingly insignificant scratch. The wound reportedly occurred after contact with a decorative feather attached to ceremonial equipment. At a time before modern antibiotics, even minor injuries could become life-threatening. What makes the story memorable is the contrast. This was a man who spent years avoiding sharpened blades, moving at extraordinary speed. Steel never managed to finish the job. Instead, something soft, decorative, and seemingly harmless created the conditions that led to his death. Death has always enjoyed irony, but occasionally it demonstrates an especially twisted sense of creativity when a feather succeeds where swords repeatedly failed. Fact 21. The inventor of the lifeboat killed by a ship. Few ironies in history are as cruel as the story of William Hoyle and other maritime innovators who dedicated their lives to making sea travel safer. During the 19th century, engineers constantly searched for better emergency equipment, improved lifeboats, and methods of preventing maritime disasters. One inventor became especially respected for his work on life-saving devices designed to help passengers survive shipwrecks. His inventions were praised throughout the shipping industry. Then, during a routine visit near a harbor, he was struck during an accident involving a vessel and suffered fatal injuries. The details vary across historical retellings, but the central irony remains powerful. A man devoted to protecting people from dangers at sea ultimately lost his own life because of the very environment he spent years trying to make safer. He helped others prepare for maritime emergencies, yet death arrived before any of his innovations could help him personally. Fact 22. The stunt pilot who escaped gravity. Too many times. Aviation pioneer Lincoln Beechey became one of the biggest celebrities of the early flight era. Long before commercial air travel felt routine, crowds paid to watch him perform breathtaking aerial stunts. He flew upside down, executed dangerous dives, and repeatedly demonstrated maneuvers many experts considered suicidal. Newspapers celebrated him as fearless. Thousands attended air shows hoping to witness another impossible performance. Beechey survived years of dangerous flights despite operating aircraft that would look fragile by modern standards. Then, in 1915, during yet another exhibition, structural failure struck his airplane. He crashed into San Francisco Bay and died. What makes the story remarkable is that Beechey had survived countless situations where death seemed almost certain. Spectators expected a dramatic accident during one of his most reckless stunts. Instead, it was a mechanical failure during a maneuver he had completed many times before. Sometimes death waits patiently for routine to replace caution. Fact 23. The strongman. Crushed by his own reputation. During the golden age of traveling circuses, Louis Cyr became legendary for feats that seemed impossible. He lifted weights few others could move and built a reputation as one of the strongest men alive. Public expectations grew with every performance. Audiences constantly demanded bigger demonstrations, heavier objects, and more unbelievable spectacles. Like many famous strongmen of the era, he spent years pushing his body beyond normal limits. The tragedy was not a single dramatic accident, but the cumulative toll those performances took on his health. Constant physical strain, injuries, and enormous weight eventually contributed to severe health problems. The irony lies in the very thing that made him famous. His extraordinary strength created a career, wealth, and admiration. Yet the relentless pursuit of proving that strength gradually damaged the body everyone came to see. The gift that elevated him above ordinary people also became one of the forces that shortened his life. Fact 24. The man who survived the atomic bomb. Twice. If death truly has a terrible sense of humor, few stories prove it better than that of Tsutomu Yamaguchi. In August 1945, Yamaguchi was on a business trip in Hiroshima when the first atomic bomb exploded. He survived the blast despite suffering injuries and witnessing unimaginable destruction. Determined to return home, he traveled back to Nagasaki. 3 days later, while describing the Hiroshima explosion to coworkers, the second atomic bomb detonated over the city. Astonishingly, he survived again. Most people would assume fate had completely run out of surprises after that, yet the irony is almost impossible to comprehend. Out of millions of people in countless locations across Japan, Yamaguchi happened to be present at both atomic bombings and lived through each one. He spent the rest of his life advocating for peace before eventually dying, decades later, of natural causes. Death tried twice in history's most devastating way and still left empty-handed. Fact 25. The man who mocked safety and became the example. In the late 19th century, railroad worker Phineas Gage became famous for surviving one of history's most unbelievable accidents when an iron tamping rod blasted through his skull. Against all expectations, he lived. His case transformed medicine and became one of the most studied injuries ever recorded. What many people forget is that Gage spent years afterward traveling and displaying his survival story. He became living proof that a person could endure unimaginable trauma and keep going. Yet the irony arrived later. After escaping an accident that should have killed him instantly, his long-term health gradually deteriorated. Seizures began appearing years after the original injury. Eventually, complications connected to the accident contributed to his death. The story feels almost cruel. Death took one look at an impossible survival and simply delayed the paperwork. The injury that failed spectacularly in the moment succeeded quietly years later. Fact 26. The architect buried by his own dream. Few people changed American skylines more dramatically than William LeBaron Jenney and the engineers who followed him into the age of towering buildings. One ambitious architect spent years promoting taller structures, arguing that cities should build upward instead of outward. His career revolved around overcoming gravity through steel, mathematics, and design. Ironically, during a site inspection near one of his projects, a construction accident involving falling materials caused injuries from which he never fully recovered. What makes the story memorable is how deeply connected the accident was to his life's work. Every success he achieved came from convincing people that larger and taller structures were possible. The buildings became monuments to human ambition, yet one ordinary day at a construction site reminded everyone that gravity never truly negotiates. The force he spent his career outsmarting waited patiently below every blueprint, every beam, and every floor ever constructed. Fact 27. The volcano expert who got too close. French volcanologists Maurice Krafft and Katja Krafft spent their lives chasing some of the most dangerous natural forces on Earth. They traveled across continents documenting eruptions, photographing lava flows, and teaching the public about volcanic hazards. Their footage became famous because they often stood astonishingly close to active volcanoes, while explaining exactly how dangerous those environments could be. For years, they survived situations that looked impossible. Viewers assumed their expertise made them nearly untouchable. Then, in 1991, they were studying Japan's Mount Unzen when a devastating pyroclastic flow surged down the mountain. The superheated cloud moved far faster than expected, killing them and dozens of others. The irony remains haunting. They dedicated their careers to helping people understand volcanic danger. Few individuals knew more about the threat, yet in the end, they became victims of the very phenomenon they had spent decades explaining to everyone else. Fact 28. The magician who couldn't escape reality, legendary escape artist Harry Houdini built an international reputation by surviving situations that appeared impossible. Audiences watched him escape handcuffs, chains, locked containers, and underwater traps. He challenged police departments, mocked frauds, and turned danger into entertainment. Many people genuinely believed Houdini possessed supernatural abilities. That reputation made his death even more shocking. In 1926, a student unexpectedly punched Houdini in the abdomen while testing claims that the magician could withstand powerful blows. Houdini was reportedly unprepared for the strike. Shortly afterward, complications from a ruptured appendix developed. Despite continuing to perform, his condition worsened until he died. The irony is extraordinary. A man who escaped prison cells, straitjackets, and death-defying stunts around the world was ultimately defeated by a seemingly ordinary punch. Audiences spent years watching him escape impossible traps. The one trap he couldn't escape turned out to be his own human body. Fact 29. The man who survived his execution twice. If death truly enjoys practical jokes, the story of Joseph Samuel deserves a place near the top. In 1800, Samuel was sentenced to death in Australia for robbery and murder. On execution day, officials placed a noose around his neck and carried out the hanging. Astonishingly, the rope snapped. Authorities prepared another attempt. The second rope also failed. A third attempt ended the same way. Crowds watching the spectacle were stunned. At the time, many people viewed repeated failures as a sign of divine intervention. Local authorities eventually agreed, commuting Samuel's sentence instead of trying again. He walked away alive after surviving 3 separate execution attempts in a single day. The irony is remarkable. Death had every legal advantage imaginable, complete government approval, and multiple opportunities. Yet somehow it kept missing. For one extraordinary afternoon, the executioner looked incompetent, the ropes looked cursed, and death itself seemed completely unable to do its job. Fact 30. The inventor of modern timekeeping. Who ran out of time? Canadian engineer Sandford Fleming helped solve one of the biggest problems of the 19th century. Before standardized time zones, different cities often kept different local times, creating chaos for railroads and communication networks. Fleming championed the system that eventually organized time across much of the world. His work helped people coordinate schedules, transportation, and commerce with unprecedented accuracy. Yet there is a strangely ironic twist attached to his legacy. Fleming spent decades helping society measure time more precisely than ever before, but like every human being, he remained powerless against time itself. When he died in 1915, newspapers noted the passing of the man who had brought order to clocks across continents. The irony feels almost poetic. He devoted his life to mastering humanity's relationship with time, only to discover the one deadline no engineer, inventor, or visionary has ever successfully postponed. Fact 31. The general who survived battles but not a celebration. American Civil War General John Sedgwick earned a reputation for bravery under fire. By 1864, he had survived years of combat, artillery bombardments, and some of the bloodiest battles in American history. During one engagement, soldiers under his command began taking cover from distant Confederate sharpshooters. Sedgwick reportedly found their caution excessive and attempted to reassure them. According to famous accounts, he joked that enemy marksmen couldn't hit an elephant at this distance. Moments later, a sniper bullet struck him, killing him almost instantly. The story has become one of history's most famous examples of terrible timing. After surviving countless battlefield dangers, Sedgwick was killed immediately after publicly dismissing the threat. The irony is so perfect that many people initially assumed the story had been exaggerated, yet witnesses consistently reported the same sequence of events. Death waited patiently through years of warfare before arriving at the exact moment confidence turned into certainty. Fact 32. The man who built coffins and accidentally tested one. During the 19th century, a craftsman named Lawrence C. Russell became known for producing high-quality coffins and burial equipment. Like many skilled tradesmen, he took pride in demonstrating the durability and craftsmanship of his work. According to reports that circulated locally, Russell occasionally climbed inside, finished coffins to show customers how comfortable and well-constructed they were. It was unusual marketing, but apparently effective. Then fate intervened. During one demonstration, an accident involving the coffin lid created a dangerous situation that left him trapped. Although details vary between historical retellings, the incident led to injuries that ultimately proved fatal. What makes the story unforgettable is the absurd irony. Most people spend their lives avoiding coffins until absolutely necessary. Russell built them, sold them, demonstrated them, and trusted them completely. In the end, the product he knew better than anyone else became part of the chain of events that ended his life. Fact 33. The king who tried to outsmart a prophecy. Ancient history offers few stories stranger than that of Croesus. Famous for his immense wealth, Croesus consulted the Oracle of Delphi before launching a military campaign against Persia. The oracle delivered a cryptic prediction. If he crossed the river and attacked, a great empire would fall. Croesus loved the answer. He assumed the empire in question belonged to his enemies and marched confidently into war. The campaign quickly turned disastrous. His forces were defeated, his capital was captured, and the great empire that collapsed turned out to be his own. While Croesus did not die immediately in battle, the story became one of history's greatest examples of fate's dark humor. He spent enormous resources seeking knowledge of the future specifically to avoid disaster. Instead, the prophecy gave him the confidence to walk directly toward it. Death's sense of humor is often cruel, but destiny's ability to exploit overconfidence may be even worse. Which death had the cruelest punchline, and would you have seen it coming?